Chapter 18. Because it was impossible to enter the geyser basins on horseback up the Yellowstone or over the Yellowstone Mountains, Sam had to go south and up the South Fork and past Hawk's Rest and down the Yellowstone to the lake. Across timbered mountains, black and beautiful with health, he followed the east side of the lake, going north, and then the north side, until he came to Steaming Springs. It was a marvel to all who had seen this coastline, for out in the cold lake were hot springs, some of them 100 yards out, and there the hot and cold waters mingled, and steam rose from the surface. At the lake's edge, a man could find water of any temperature, between icy cold and almost boiling. Before going to the area on the west side of pouting and hissing paint and mud pots, Sam stripped off and plunged in. He had known no experience more exhilarating than swimming back and forth through extremes of hot and cold. It was such a delightful and thrilling surrender of his senses to the caresses that, floating on his back and looking up at the blue, he said to the Creator, in Bill's language, "No man alive ever made a bath pool like this'n." What was it the woman had read from the Holy Book? "The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them." How glad he was to be here, solitary, alone, and safe in the wilderness. This evening he was entertained by the mud-pots, which he thought of as mud-mouths. They took him back to the blonde neighbor girl named Nancy, who had puffed her cheeks at him and then slapped them with both palms, pretending that her face had exploded. Another of her impish tricks had been to puff her cheeks as far out as she could, and then insert a small reed between her lips. It was, she gravely told him, a puncture. As she forced air out through the reed, her cheeks slowly collapsed, her blue eyes all the while soberly watching him. The hot mud mouths puffed their lips out and up, and sometimes the lips parted, and a burst of hot steam breath shot up, and sometimes the lips were expanded to astonishing fullness without parting, like thin gray rubber of a toad's throat, and now and then they sucked back and forth, as Nancy had sucked her lips in and pushed them out. Sitting on warm earth among the mud pots, he tried to write a letter to his parents. Unlike the great explorers Lewis and Clark, who had come through the Rocky Mountain land before Sam was born, or famous scouts like Bridger and Carson and Greenwood, Sam had had 12 years in good schools. With notepad on his knees and brows perplexed, he wrote the salutation, and then for 10 minutes wondered what to say and what not to say. Should he tell them that he had taken up arms against an entire Indian nation, and next spring would be on the warpath again? No, he wouldn't worry them with that. Should he tell them that he had married a lovely and loving Indian girl, who only a few months later had been struck down by a pack of killers? Should he tell them that he stood chance of being dead within a year? No, he would tell them only pleasant things. He recalled how one morning his mother had looked out at a wide-spreading apple tree with 5 bushels of ripe apples on it, and said, "This is the first time I ever thought of an apple tree as a mother." His mouth watered as he remembered the sound, fragrance, and the juices bursting past his lips as he sank strong teeth in those apples. Wah! If only he had one now. Well, he would tell them that the more he looked round the world, the plainer became the glorious truth that the Creator was a great artist in all fields. His paintings, which included sunsets and mornings, mountain lakes in pure jeweled radiance, and the firmament with two rainbows across it after a rain, were Rubens and Rembrandt on canvas as big as worlds. What sculptor would dare set his puny and trifling creations beside the Tetons, or the Black Hills, or the Wind River Range, or the vast acres of Ruga in the lava flows over by the Snake? The Creator had more bird musicians playing their arias with flute, piccolo, harp, and tiny horn than any man could guess at. In any moment of the 24 hours there were millions of bird throats singing. In his stupendous orchestrations the Creator could overwhelm a man with his mastery of counterpoint in rivers and winds and thunders, or with the variations in his cosmic sonatas. Sam would tell his father he ought to be out here, for he remembered the man's deep emotion when he listened to the conclusion of the second movement of Beethoven's Third or the F minor sonata. If only he could hear the music in this wild land, the horn calls of the loon, coot, crane, helldiver grebe, or the incredible music of the snipe's tail feathers at dusk. He would tell them that snow was falling in winter blankets on the forests now, but that he was sitting on hot earth, with hot water boiling out all around him. If they were here, they might be looking at small puffs of steam above a stone basin, and a few moments later see 1,000,000 gallons of boiling water hurled 100 feet into the air, to fall downward in streamers and mists, as still other millions of gallons exploded from the world's hot insides. Deep warm fog in sub-zero weather would envelop them. He would try to make them understand what a divine loveliness it was when, in heavy snowstorm, the millions of flakes, many as large as oak leaves, descended into the atmosphere above one of the steam vents. How, looking up, they would see the millions of them coming down, how they would see them vanish by millions, as in the winking of an eye they melted and fell in big fat raindrops. How they would marvel at this enormous chamber of heat within a circumference of pure white snow. In 100 or 200 steps from hot earth they would find snow 6 or 8 feet deep. In only a few seconds they could walk from 30 degrees below zero cold into such warmth that they could stand in comfort with all their clothes off. They could lie in a hot natural pool and see trees so cold that they were bursting open. He would spend the winter here, alone, thinking of his wife and son, without having to keep his eyes skinned, as Windy Bill would say, day and night. The snow all around him, except in the hot places, might be 8 or 10 feet deep, but the grass was tall, and his horses would paw the snow away to find it. He would get 2 or 3 elk before the heaviest snows came. He would jerk some meat and hang up some hindquarters, and he might go south to the Big Snake, where he would find whole mountainsides of berry bushes bent under their fruit. Like the red people, he might gather some acorns, pine nuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts, and of berries the service, elder, choke, thimble, as well as big juicy yellow currants and rich wild plums. Away down south, beyond the San Juans, was a tall sage plant, the seeds of which Indians pounded into flour. Jim Bridger called it chia. He said bread made of it was so strong that when washing his hands, a man had to be careful or he would pull his fingers off. The Creator had put an abundance of food in the land, and there was no tax on it. Had they ever heard of wild broom corn and balsam root? If they would come out for a visit, their son would set before them such feasts as they had never known, and they could take home a bag of pemmican made of buffalo tenderloin, hump fat, huckleberries, and arrowroot jelly. Tongue in cheek, he would tell them that they might wish to sample red ant cakes made of the terrible big red ant mixed with camas roots and onion bulbs. Or for breakfast, with their pancakes, they might like a hash of grasshoppers, or rattlesnake broiled on cedar embers, or a paste of castoreum. That was the orange-brown stuff from the beaver, with a strong wild odor, which trappers used as a lure. Above all, he would ask them to imagine the kind of winter he was spending with its pure mountain streams, its deep white snows, its millions of acres of forest that an axe had never touched, its abundance of food, its cathedral quiet when the birds were hushed, its hot baths and chambers, all as free as a mother's love for her child. After writing the letter, he wrapped it in buckskin to keep it dry and safe from mice. He lingered a few days at the delightful hot springs by the lake and then crossed the low mountain range to the geyser basins. He was now in dense forest that lay before him in all directions for 100 miles. Under a huge pine just south of the geyser that would someday be known as Old Faithful, he made his camp. When it became cold enough to keep meat with jerking it, he brought in both elk and deer, and the choicest portions he hung from branches of trees, loosely shrouded in buckskin sheaths. He had plenty of salt, sugar, coffee, tobacco, a 50-pound bag of flour, 1,000 rounds of ammunition, seeds and nuts, and dried fruit, perfect health, and a mountain appetite. What more, he would have asked the philosophers, did any man want? And all of it was free. It was in his thankful moods, induced by thunder's magnificent orchestrations, or the witchery of high mountain snowstorms, that he would climb to the spine of a range and stride along it, flinging his arms toward heaven and pouring song from his throat. The wonder of being alive and healthy and free was for him such a miracle that only in song could he express his gratitude. "Thank you, thank you," he would cry, his red face and golden beard turned up to the storm. Then he would go on long strides, singing into the thunder or the snow, or with his feeble music try to be an instrument in the cosmic harmonies. An Empyrean glissando in the rolling chords of thunder might abash him for a few moments, but soon he would be exploding his loud cries in his effort to develop his theme of joy in life over the theme of death levels all, and he would try to build his own crescendo as though he were a bassoon or a French horn, all the while waving his arms to bring in other instruments, the whole 10,000 of them, for the celestial finale. Once by a slim chance, Bill had seen this red-bearded giant striding against the skyline down a mountain's back, and had said later to Hank Caddy that he figured Sam had been touched by the death of his wife, for there he was, up yonder, like a buffalo bull, full of mush and molasses, bellowing his head off. Had Hank ever seen the likes of him? Hank said in his slow, over-deliberate way that he expected Sam was just happy. He hadn't ever knowed a man loved life like Sam. Sam was writing a lyric in the only way he knew, or a paean of thanksgiving, for he thought that life was indeed a wilderness of sweets, and his transports carried him now and then to bel cantos so wild that most men would have thought them pure lunacy. Sam was enraptured, enchanted, fascinated by the simple fact of being alive and healthy. With no clock to watch, no boss over him, no taxes to pay, no papers to sign, nobody to give an accounting to except the Creator, where he was glad to thank morning, noon, and night. He would have said that in an ideal world every man should have at least 10,000 acres on which to stride and explode and feel free. That was a puny spot, that many acres, but a man could turn around on it. He had heard McNeese say that at the rate babies were being born all over the earth, the time would come when no man could find room to stand on and blow his nose. It was Bill who told Kate about Sam Minard. He told her that Sam strode up and down all the mountain spines in the west, singing into the heavens and praising God. Thereafter, Kate always saw him when she looked for him. She would look off in the direction of the Big Belt or Bear Paw Mountains, though from where she stood she could see none of them, and there in the sky was a stupendous range, and Sam striding along the crests, looking as tall as pine trees, a gigantic figure with flaming hair and beard, and a voice that could be heard halfway around the world. It got to be a habit with her to stare at him in the far blue mists and listen to his singing. One of the best cooks among mountain men, Sam's specialty was steaks. He had learned that steaks broiled over embers absorbed the flavor of the wood, and so he had used all the kinds of wood he would find. Pine, fir, spruce, and cedar he didn't like, for they were too strong. Aspen and willow were better. Alder was fair. The flavors of woods also appeared in tanning. Those squaws did the best tanning in both odors and textures, who had the best wood for it. Sam could smell a piece of leather and usually tell what wood had been used. He wouldn't wear leather for which the wood had been the poplar, willow, aspen, birch, or plum. It took him 5 or 6 hours to broil 10 pounds of elk steaks and to make 2 pans of biscuits. It was the steaks that took so much time and digging the fat out of marrow bones. The embers had to be just right, and he had to hover over the meat lest it absorb too much of the wood odor. Here in the geyser basin he had some pepper beans, which he powdered in a mortar. For butter on his biscuits he used marrow. He had wild honey, which he had robbed bees of. When his meal was ready, he feasted on juicy dripping steaks, biscuits sopped with marrow fat and honey, and coffee. While eating, he would look out to watch the geyser blow. He could have felt no safer from the red men if he had been encamped at the entrance to hell. His chief problem was his appetite. He had to have 3 big meals every day, and if they were all hot meals, most of the time was spent cooking. The livers he ate raw or warmed through and seasoned, and every day he ate a handful of rose hips for the reason that Bill Williams said every mountain man should. He also ate uncooked the livers from trout and grouse. They were extremely tender and savory. One of his chief joys in winter-time was to walk in deep snowstorm, when there was no wind, but only the loveliness of movement and design, light and shadow, as the countless flake like tumbling moths came down in such density and in such dodging, weaving, swirling grace that he found it amazing that no 2 flakes ever seemed to collide. They reminded him of the fantastically intricate dance of gnats, when thousands of them, in a tight swarm, moved for hours in a pattern so complex and yet so perfect that no one man could believe it possible who hadn't seen it. He marveled at the flight of birds. He had watched red-winged blackbirds passing over him in early morning on their way to feeding grounds, and he had guessed their number in the hundreds of thousands, possibly in millions, for they had been flying at a speed of 20 or 30 miles an hour, yet had darkened the sky above him for 30 minutes. All of them darted and bobbed and dipped and capered like birds out of their minds with joy, yet he had never seen two of them touch one another. He would lie on his back in soft new snow, a foot deep, and gaze at the myriad flakes until his senses swam, and never once had he seen a flaw in the constantly changing and infinitely complex pattern. It was as if every flake had eyes. He could never foresee where one would come to rest, for until the very instant of touching snow, earth, or water, it was weaving and dancing and changing its course. Yet it came to rest as if it had found the inevitable and perfect spot for its soft little cargo of frozen water. He would rise and walk again, and in the gentle, wonderful world of white storm and dusk he would see wild things, his neighbors, the rabbits, birds, deer, weasels, bobcats, all acting as if they were as glad and thankful as he. A deer, ears pointed toward him, would stand and gaze at him, its coloring blending so perfectly with the storm's gray dusk that it hardly looked alive, and then it would move soundlessly away and vanish, like a patch of slightly darker dusk dissolving into the storm. The rabbits were gentler, the birds tamer in a deep storm. All wild things seemed to feel the grace of benediction. The melting flakes reached down over his face like tiny cold fingers. The snow on his golden hair sopped it and turned it curly. He felt the damp against his moccasined feet, the chill down his spine. The geyser to which he came now was larger and angrier than the one by his camp. It exploded its furies only once in a while. He was lucky, for as he approached the geyser, he heard the hissing and rumbling up its hot throat, and after a few minutes saw first a prelude of belchings, as of a throat being cleared, and then the immense quantities of boiling water vaulting upward to spill downward like shattered waterfalls. The geyser then seemed to pause, as if gathering the forces in the depths of its belly, and then vomited even more sensationally, with the steam devouring the storm over a wide area. Hot water fell downward in tumbling piles of vapor, and flowed in steaming rivers toward him. This colossal eruption in the depths of a snowstorm was, Sam told himself, as beautiful as anything he had ever seen or heard. A man just about had to believe that Beethoven had seen it. Dropping to his knees, he swept the snow back and put an ear to the stone crust. He thought he could hear monstrous rumblings and heavings of subterranean waters, as though the whole earth might burst open in one self-consuming vomit. No wonder the redmen fled this spot. Sam backed away from it and into the storm, and watched, entranced, until the last furious puffs and snorts had been blown out of the throat, and the underground angers had fallen back into the belly's gurglings. In cupped palms he gathered hot water and drank it. 200 or 300 miles south were the soda springs, by the Oregon Trail, from which he had drunk. He liked those waters and their catharsis, but these, in Coulter's violins, tasted of alkali and bitter salts. After he had rubbed his horses down and eaten a big supper, he spread his bed on earth that fire had warmed and lay, snugly enfolded, and wondered about his future. He suspected, in these deeper moments of calm, that he had been a bit of a fool to fling a challenge into the beautiful white teeth of a whole nation. For as long as the vendetta endured, he would have to be vigilant 24 hours a day, the whole year round. He had no wish to spend his life in a blood feud, but he could think of no sensible and honorable way to withdraw. The Red people loved feuds and warpaths and undying hates. They wouldn't want him to ask for peace. And there were the Blackfeet and Cheyennes, possibly even the Sioux and the Arapahoes, all determined to capture him, and every scalp he lifted would boost the ransom. It was not that he was afraid. He was as much a stranger to fear as the human male can be. It was not that he would feel sorry for himself if he fell under the red man's weapons. It was that he knew a simple truth, that men who loved life were not men who liked to kill. He would never be able to put out of memory the shocked and paralyzed youngster who had looked at him, or the ungainly, pathetic body hanging from the tree. Besides, he wanted to trap and hunt, cook and eat and sleep, without having to be watchful every minute. He'd not mind too much staying on the warpath another year, if the hot-blooded idiots would then wipe their knives and go home. They would never do that. He had begun to think that most men in the world wanted nothing more than any enemy whom they could hate and plot against. He didn't pretend to know why this was so. He hoped the next summer to ride over to visit his father-in-law. He might take a gift of 4 or 5 gallons of rum. Like all the red men, Tall Mountain had an enormous thirst for it. Living in an area meager with game and pelts, he didn't have much to trade that white men wanted. He would be transported to a red heaven if Sam were to make a long journey to see him. A white son visits his red father and rides 200 miles right through Blackfeet country. During this winter of reflection, with its many marvelous storms, there were tasks to keep him busy. He had garments to make. Because his hands were so large, he wasn't nimble with needle and thread. Bare Paws Meek, fat and jolly and tobacco-stained, had large hands, but he had a pianist's mastery of them. There was nothing dainty or artistic in Sam's sewing. He punched holes through the leather with a bone awl, thrust the needle through, and pulled the leather thread through one hole after another to make his moccasins and leggings, trousers and jackets. While sewing, he would wonder what kind of people they were back east and over in Europe who clamored to buy the scalps of the red people. Would they also be eager to buy testicles? He also made, during this winter, several pairs of moccasins for the bay. He expected next summer to be pursued not only by Crows, but by war parties from the Blackfeet and Cheyennes. In certain dangerous situations, 2 or 3 layers of leather over the stone hoofs of a horse were the difference between life and death. If he were to outwit the warriors the old chief sent against him, he would need to be master of warcraft and woodcraft, equal to Kit Carson in the first and Jim Bridger in the second. He was pretty sure that he had got wolf teeth. 2 years earlier he had seen this brave showing off on his pony and had marveled that a man could ride with such grace and skill. It was said that some of the Crow warriors could hit flying birds with a rifle, that some were so noiseless they could slip up to the sleeping wolf and take it by the tail, and that some could devise phenomenal deceptions in ambush. Sam wasn't at all sure that he would be alive when the next frost came, but he was a fatalist. A man like the buffalo or elk bull could only do his best, and when his time came, let go his grip on life and slip under. As spring approached, he put his weapons in perfect condition. A knife got dull and needed a lot of fine honing. He had 2 bowies, so that in a tight place he could lay enemies open with both hands. In a buckskin pouch he had pieces of obsidian and filing whetstone, which he had saturated with hot goose oil to make oilstones, and hard and soft leathers. One knife, his finest, he kept wrapped in soft oiled leather. The other was his hunting and kitchen knife. His rifle and revolvers he kept spotless. He was not the kind of shot with a revolver that Bill Hickok would be a few years later, or with a rifle as a man named Carver would be. But he felt that he was a match for the Crows, for the reason that his nerve would be steadier. The red men in a crisis were notoriously bad shots. Bridger said it was because for the red man a gun was big medicine and all medicine was magic. If you were using magic, you didn't have to pay much attention to sights or wind drift or buck ague. Buck ague or buck fever the mountain men called buck ague. They meant the trembles and the willies when a man suddenly faced a charging grizzly or bull moose. The red men, as Sam had sized them up, were pretty good fighters when running or riding hell-bent in a pack, because the heat of battle and the presence around them of their own kind brought their courage to the fusing point. But alone, man to man or man to grizzly, without war cries and wild commotion, few of them had the heart for it. Now and then one preferred to fight alone for the glory of it. It was these, Sam knew, who would be sent against him. During this winter, when he lay snugly warm in the dark midnight of another dead day, he faced the possibility of capture, and so thought of the squaws. Tom Fitzpatrick said they were red women, not squaws, but Sam knew that squaw was the word for female among the Massachusetts Indians. Most mountain men thought them too cruel and ferocious to be called women, much less ladies. For look at the way some of them beat their dogs. When the squaws of most tribes went for firewood, they used dogs with their treves or toboggans. The dogs of the Crows looked to Sam like a cross between wolves and raw-boned shaggy mongrels. They looked mean and evil, and they were lazy. When harnessed to the toboggans, they were a sight to make the white men die laughing. They sank back on their haunches like balky mules, and with tongues lolling and crafty eyes half closed, they simply sat. The squaws then would run shrieking at them, and the dogs would slink away toward the woods. But after the toboggans were loaded with wood, the dogs sank not to their hams, but to their bellies, and like the mother grouse protecting her young, pretended to be wounded. It had looked to Sam as if some of them had feigned sickness. Ungovernable furies then seized the squaws. Screaming and wailing, they would grasp heavy cudgels, and running up to the dogs, almost knock their heads off. Sam had never seen his lotus angry or brutal with any creature. Sam had dug a bath hole in the earth, into which and out of which hot water flowed, and in the hole he soaked himself every day. What a land it was! All over its broad breast there were hot springs. Bridger said it was possible to travel 1,000 miles and have a hot spring at every campsite. Since Sam had learned, with the Indians, to bathe in cold water, winter and summer, It was a delightful luxury to lie half asleep in a hot pool, and this with the sumptuous meals, the magnificent mountain winter all around him, the crisp purity of the air, and the wild things in the silence and aloneness made him unwilling to leave the basin. With Lotus and his son, he would have been content to live here forever. It seemed to him that in winter time most people suffered a wintering of their emotions. And one other thing he had learned, that the folk in cities never got a chance to know themselves and one another. In this land where enemies honed a man's wits and the forces of nature kept him trimmed of physical and emotional fat, a person had to learn what he was and what he was not. It was late April before Sam reluctantly saddled and packed his beasts, hung a revolver and knife from his waist, mounted the bay, and sat for 10 minutes looking around him. He then went over to the lake and down the west side to the headwaters of Snake River, and followed the river to the broad valley of the Tetons. On one of the streams flowing past those magnificent sculpturings, he expected to find Wind River Bill. Chapter 19. "Wall now, I'll be cussed for a porcupine," Bill cried as Sam rode up to his cabin door. "If it ain't the crow killer himself, I'll be hog-tied and earmarked. Sam, where in hell have you been?" "Out and around," Sam said. "Dog my hide," said Bill, staring. "We had figured you was dead and tuck. We been awful uneasy. Have you heard they are calling ye the Terror?" "Hadn't heard that," Sam said, dismounting. He was looking round him when back in a recess he saw Zeke Campbell squinting at him. Zeke, Sam had no doubt, was the most taciturn man in the world. He had seen him 12 times and had never heard him utter 12 words. His usual affirmative was an almost inaudible grunt. His negative was a cold stare through the smoke from the pipe. In size and strength and agility he was only average. The most unusual thing in his appearance, for Sam anyway, was his hair. His beard so completely covered his face that only the forehead and the small green eyes were visible. Zeke even had hair all the way down the bridge of his nose. His hair was a bronze color. When it was full of sunlight, the man's face looked hidden behind a thicket of golden wires. "How are you, Zeke?" Sam said. Zeke grunted. Bill said, "I smell sulfur." He came up to Sam and breathed in. "I expect you been in the boilins," he said. "How strapping," Sam said. At once Bill looked downcast. Soon a man would starve to death without he duck his fingernails off. And even then he would get ganter and ganter. Between him and Zeke they had only about 5 packs, though they had worked like 2 coons climbing greased poles. "Any extra tobacco?" "Well, now, they did have plenty of that." Bill went to a hidden cache and returned with a few inches of twist. "Fill your pipe, Sam, and rest your hinder. Tell us what you've been up to in the boilins." This evening Bill cooked a supper of lean elk roast, beaver tail, muskrat broth, and coffee. And after the men had eaten and filled their pipes, they sat by a loud-talking fir and cedar fire and wondered aloud about this and that. "I wonder," Bill said, "about old George." He meant Bear Paws Meek. George had gone into the Bear Paws Mountains all alone, smack dab into the middle of Blackfeet country. Was George tired of life? George was a smart coon, Sam said. "Many's the smart coon ended up in the pot," Bill said. "He might as well have sat down at Three Forks and blowed his bull whistle. I figure George is gone under. I surely do." He doubted that, Sam said. George had been up that way twice before and had come back. Bill scratched through his thick hair to his unwashed skull. "He and Zeke," he said, had a close shave last fall. In fact, two. One was the Cheyennes. Zeke was up Bull Elk Creek on a trap line, and Bill had just brought in a fine buck and was skinning it when suddenly 4 red devils appeared out of nowheres with so much grease and coal dust smeared over their faces that at first Bill had thought they were niggers, but his second glance saw their headdress, his third, the scalps. Wall, doggone it! If there was one thing the white man knew he must not do in such a situation, it was to reach for his gun. Bill said he was bent over with skinning knife, and he just remained bent over and let the knife fall, his mind wondering how he could warn Zeke. As sure as varmints, Zeke at any moment would come back and walk right into his own funeral. Bill broke off in the story, filled his lungs with strong tobacco fumes, and exploded smoke from 2 hairy nostrils. His mind, he said, was thinking like a horse loping, but there was nothing in it. He had never had such an empty mind in all his born life. He knew, of course, that the red killers were asking theirselves if he was alone, or if maybe 2 or 3 men were back in the brush, looking towards them. "I tell you, I was plumb scared. I surely was." He figured, Bill said, that his hump fat was as good as gone. His rifle was 6 feet from him, his revolvers were hanging over a limb not far from his rifle, and his knife lay at his feet. He was trying to remember some prayer to say when suddenly there was an explosion that sounded like the bursting of 20 rifle barrels. The red man closest to Bill fell almost on top of him, but Bill didn't wait around to see if the varmint was down for good. In the instant he heard the shot, he knew that Zeke had let daylight into the soul of one of them. In the next instant he had plunged his knife into the belly of another, and in the third instant the other 2 took to their heels like antelope in a high wind. They collated that a Hull war party had descended on them. Zeke had had time to reload, and he dropped the third. The fourth then took to wings, and when they last saw him, he was 10 miles above the Tetons. Their other close shave was with 2 crows. Bill guessed that these 2 had it figured that he was the terror, for at the moment when they came in sight of him, he was standing on the humped back of a log in a beaver pond and looked a foot taller than he was. He guessed that one of both of them belonged to the 20 the old chief had chosen to bring in Sam's topknot and ears. They had him dead to rights, for like the fool he had been ever since he left his mother's knee, he had stood his rifle against a tree and had gone toad-hopping from log to log, looking for a floater stick that would show where a beaver trap was hiding in the deep water below. It was Zeke who again saved his life. Through a cloud of smoke, Sam looked over at Zeke. Though safer in pairs, the mountain men usually trapped alone. A lone trapper never for a moment put his rifle more than a few inches from his grasp. But no matter how wary they were, they died violent deaths, one by one, year after year. There was never a rendezvous at Pierce Hall, or Brown's, or Laramie, or Union, or Bent, that they didn't look round to see which faces were missing. Bill was now looking at Sam. He guessed Sam knew that he had killed 5, maybe 6, of the 20 sent out to take him, and that the others were waiting for him to come out of Coulter's bilins. He had heard from Charlie that these braves had met in a secret powwow and had cast lots to see which of them would have the first chance at the terror's scalp. The lot had fallen to Eaglebeak. "Don't reckon I ever heard of him," Sam said. "Wall, now, if you put a few rattlesnakes, a wolverine, a bitch wolf, a falcon hawk, and a nest of hornets in a pot and stirred them well, and then pulled out an Injun, it would be the one who had sworn to cut off Sam's ears and scalp, and cut out his liver before the first currants were ripe. Charlie said Eaglebeak had slain 2 Blackfeet before he was old enough to know what a woman was for. The first currants are ripe about July," Sam said. There was a long silence. Zeke puffed his old smelly pipe and stared at Sam under 2 brows that looked as tough as bat straw. Bill was also studying the Menard countenance. "Where was he headed for?" Bill asked at last. "The Mussel Shell," Sam said. In Bill's mind was a map of the route Sam probably would take, the path up Dog Creek and then over to Buffalo Fork, from there over to the Dunoir, and up it to the South Fork, and down it all the way to the Bighorn. He would then be south of the Mussel Shell at its big bend. Still, Bill reflected, sucking into his lungs a man-killing mixture of strong old tobacco and kinnikinnick, Sam might not take the well-worn way, knowing that killers were on his trail. As likely as not, he would go over to the Badlands and ride right through Wind River Valley. "Wonder if she lived through the winter," Sam said. Bill said he had taken a fresh head and put it on one of the stakes, for he figured that fresh sign of the white man's hatchet might be good medicine. "She had acted awful disordered and scared, but she always had." When he rode up early one morning, she was gathering wildflower seeds. He had talked to her, but she had paid no heed, and she hadn't tried to point her gun at him or anything. Did Sam collate ever to figure her out? "I don't collate I'll ever figure any woman out." How woman, made of man's rib, could be so different was a riddle. Old Bill Williams, he said a woman's breast was like the hardest rock, and there was no trail on it that he could find. This crazy woman's breast seemed to be all butter. Any woman's was, Sam said, for her children. "And for nothing else, I guess. And white gals, they're too much like pictures." "I reckon," Sam said, quietly smoking. "Ever heard hide or hair of her husband?" "Heard he was alive, but I doubt it." "That was Abner Back," Bill said. "Abner said the husband had escaped and was on the warpath. Crazy boat, that was what they were calling him. A terror as bald as lost scalp, hiding somewhere by the Great Falls." Sam had taken from a leather pouch a notepad and a pencil. He said he wanted Bill to write a letter for him to the Crows. "Doggone it, Sam, I can't write. You know that. But what's on your mind, anyhow?" Sam said he wanted the rest of the Braves to come on, so they could get it over with. He would send them a few choice insults. With notepad and poised pencil, Sam waited. "Well, now," Bill said, "he might think of one or two he had learned." Bill spoke the syllables and Sam wrote them down. The first one said, "Bawara Peak See by him." As nearly as he had been able to tell, Bill said, "That one meant, once in a while I'll cut your balls off." If that was what it meant, Sam said, it was almost enough in itself. Most men seem to be horribly sensitive to an attack on that part of them. Did he have another one as good? Bill searched a mind that since he came west had paled under the snows of many winters. Why didn't Sam say simply that he intended to wipe them out, one by one, or in litters and batches, and send their topknots to the Blackfeet? That was fine, Sam said. How did he spell it out? After Bill had pronounced the words over and over, Sam had this on his notepad. Di wapa wima siki hei kiko. He said there seemed to be a lot of pa and ma in that one, and gave the paper to Bill, who could give it to Charlie when he saw him, and ask him to read it to the whole nation. Bill said it all reminded him of a Mormon. This fool from a wagon train of greenhorns had taken his holy book and a man to interpret, and had gone to the Cheyennes to make Mormons of them. Seems the Mormons believed the red people were one of the lost tribes of Jews, or something like that, and this preacher went over to tell them the good news. A fool of uncommon size, he stood on a tree stump facing 300 warriors, their hair glistening with buffalo fat, his face boyish and simple and rosy red, and he told these red devils that they were lost Jews whose ancestors millions of moons ago had somehow crossed to South America. He told them they would all go down to hell and fry in hump fat eternally if they didn't wash off their war paint and come every Sunday to hear Brigham Young preach the gospel. What then happened to that poor greenhorn was enough to make white women give up having babies. He was tucked away and spitted and roasted like a goose, and his holy book's leaves made some of the brightest flames in the fire. The Indians didn't look like Jews, Sam said. They surely don't, Bill said. I thought their chief belief was a lot of wives. Well, now, Jim Bridger, he had talked to Brigham. He said Mormons were a special people, like the Jews once were. Sam said he reckoned all people thought they were special people. After trapping with Bill and Zeke for 2 weeks, Sam said he guessed he would be gone, to see if Eagle Beak wanted a hugging match. He would leave his pack horses and pelts with them, and if his topknot was lifted out yonder, Zeke and Bill could have the pelts and horses. When Sam turned to leave, the emotion in Bill was running deep. He managed to say at last, I figure you just have to get it over with. For them, said Sam dryly. He mounted the bay and turned for a moment to say goodbye. Zeke and Bill stood side by side, looking at him. Watch your topknots, Sam said, and raised his right hand in a goodbye salute. Watch yourn, Bill said. He felt like crying a little. Zeke was silent. Chapter 20. Sam had so abandoned himself to a delightful winter of hot baths, hot meals, mountain climbing, music, and deep sleeps that his weariness was not what it had been. He made a conscious effort to shake himself out of his notion that all was well, and to realize, after entering the Wind River desolation, that he was in Crow country, and was a hunted man in the lands of 5 nations and 10,000 enemies. In Crow villages the squaws were still gouging themselves with sharp flints and wailing at the heavens because of the dead braves the terror had slain. What a day it would be for Sam Minard if he ever fell, wounded perhaps, into the clutch of the Crow women. How they would spit their mucus in his face and empty their bladders and bowels over him. There was nothing the inflamed and shrieking lunatics would not do. They would hack testicles off, tiny piece by piece, dig out eyes with sharpened hawthorn sticks, skewer the end of a tongue and pull it out, and slice it off in thin slices, run knife points along gums where they met the teeth, and slice the gums down and back. The frightfulness of their cruelties and obscenities, said those who had been captured and had escaped, could be known only to those who had suffered them. Sam was telling himself these things. Were these human females and mothers? It made a man look back to his own mother and wonder if he had ever really known her. He didn't intend to be taken alive. He had told Bill that, and Bill had filled his pipe and said that a lot of men said they would never be taken alive, but had been taken. If they took a man by surprise and he found a rifle barrel against his back, or if he looked up from his supper or his skinning to see a dozen warriors with drawn bows and knives, hope would rape his mind and paralyze his will, and he would surrender and begin to pray for escape. Sam rode straight into the heart of Crow country, his thoughts now and then leaping into the north, where the bones of his wife and child were in a cold cairn, and a woman sat by two graves. Before long now he would travel only by night. His camps would be fireless, and his food cold, until he reached the Yellowstone. His sole task in the next few days was to leave his mark across Crow country. It was his 7th day out after leaving Bill and Zeke. He was riding along Wind River Canyon when he came to large hot springs just north of Owl Creek Mountains. He wanted a hot bath, but knowing that he would be a fool to linger there a moment, he headed north and east to the foothills of the Bighorns. The desolate country he was now crossing would become, before many years passed, the site of famous battles between red men and white. He rode through the late afternoon and the dusk, and most of this night, never for a moment doubting that he was being trailed. Now and then he turned abruptly off the path and hid, hoping to surprise his enemy. But this crow was not to be tricked. Maybe it was Eagle Beak, or maybe it was Night Owl. Sam didn't like it at all. He had allowed himself to be outmaneuvered, for he was now in eroded hill country, with steep ravines, deep washouts, grotesque stone bluffs. There were countless places where an enemy could hide and look across sights at him. From a ridge, a pile of stones, a cave, a few stunted trees. He was reminded of an old mountain man's words. When you is trailed in open country, ride backwards. Then you can see what's behind ye, and your horse will see what's ahead. His gaze searching the landscape in pale moonlight, Sam told himself he had better get out of here. He had been across this part of the Wind River desolation only once before, and was not familiar with it. In the north he could see piles of mountain or of cloud, but to the east or west he could see only the fantastic wastelands carved by winds and water. The ground was so stony and pitted that he could risk his horse if he tried to outrun a foe, and there were no good places where he could hide and wait. It was about 2 hours before daylight. He had just ridden up out of a ravine and reached the crest of a hill when he felt the sudden sledgehammer blow of it. In that fraction of a moment he knew all that any man could have known about it, that he had been shot and the bullet had gone through him, or the bullet had smashed his rifle, or had struck the carved hawthorn handle of the bowie. In that split instant he reached a decision that was practically reflex action. Dropping the bridle reins, he pitched forward, head first, like a man shot from his horse. But it was a planned falling. His horse would stand against great provocation when the reins were down. His life, he knew, would depend on his lying in such a position that he could see, if with no more than the corner of one eye, the bay's head. Against an unseen foe, who could be no more than 100 or 200 yards away, this looked like the best of his chances. And so, in the moment of striking the earth and sprawling on it, Sam flung himself half around, so that with his left eye he could look up at the bay and watch the signals. They would be better signals than those of killdeer or red-winged blackbird. To anyone standing in the area and looking over at him, he appeared to be a man who had plunged headfirst off his horse and was now dead or unconscious. Both hands were under his lower ribs, by design, one on the right, the other at the left of his breastbone. With palms outspread against the earth, his rump was humped up a few inches, as though he had jackknifed. His head was jammed back between his shoulders and turned down to one side. One leg lay straight out, the other at a right angle against it. His mind in these few moments had been working at lightning speed. He knew now that a crow, who was a master of stealth, had flanked him on the right and a little ahead of him, and out there, laying his gun across a stone or a hummock, had taken steady aim at Sam Minard's torso and fired. Since Sam had almost instantly pitched off like a mortally wounded man, the Indian would have little doubt that he had shot him through. But on approaching, he would be as wary as the wolf. He might wait half an hour before making a move. But Sam was fairly comfortable and full of ironic contempt for himself. What an idiot a man was when he hung guns around his belly and thought he was safe. Because his self-esteem had suffered such a shock, he told himself that he might catch a few winks of sleep while the Red Devil was deciding whether his enemy was dead or feigned. The bitter flashes of mirth came and went in him, for he knew that he stood a good chance to be dead within an hour. There might be a dozen Indians out there, or if there was only one, he might come within 100 feet of Sam and shoot him again. He was not so sure now that his pitching off headlong had been the best plan. It might have been better to have made a run for it, though in that case the Indian would have shot his horse from under him. If it was a brave not fully seasoned in battle, he wouldn't shoot a second time. As softly as the wolf, he would approach, step by step, gun reloaded, knife drawn. Or in his deadly soundless way, he might approach with only tomahawk in one hand, knife in the other. He wouldn't know that Sam was watching the head of the bay, or that the movements of eyes, ears, and the whole face would tell him, as surely as Sam's own eyes could have done, the moment the Indian left his hiding place and started forward. The bay's eyes, his ears, his nostrils, the position of his head, and the visible sensation through his whole body would tell Sam in every moment what the red man was doing and how close he was. Sam would have said that a full hour passed before a sudden movement in the bay's head told him that the enemy had become visible. Sam now considered leaping up with his rifle and making a duel of it, but he was not sure that his rifle would fire. Even so, his enemy would have the advantage of the first shot. If the Indian was as cool as ice, and some of the red warriors were, the second shot would mark the end of Sam Minard. Or if the second shot dropped his horse and the Indian had Confederates, Sam would be as good as dead. He decided that his best chance was to play as dead as gone beaver. The bay's ears, eyes, nostrils, and whole face told Sam that the red man was advancing. Sam could hear no sound of feet. He had not expected to. His right eye was buried and could see nothing, but the upper part of his left eye had a clear view of the horse's head, neck, and shoulders. The ears were now up and forward. The eyes were standing out, a little in anger and fear. There were spasms in the nostrils and the neck muscles. By the direction of the beast's gaze, Sam knew that the Indian was coming in from the right and front. He felt a wish to examine the handle of his bowie and the stock of his rifle, for he felt sure that the bullet had struck one of them. He could feel no wound. He had no sense of bleeding. What a lucky fool he had been! But as Jim Bridger said, a man got real big luck only once. Sam didn't dare to make the slightest move, for the Indian's eyes were almost as keen as the hawk's. Knowing that the foe was slowly coming in and that the slightest movement would fetch a bullet into his back, Sam barely breathed. When he saw the bay's eyes open wider for a moment, then return to their normal position, he knew that the Indian had paused. In fancy, Sam could see him there, crouched, silent, peering, listening. What a hero homecoming he was dreaming of, when, waving the terror's scalp, he accepted the shrieking acclaim of his people. It was because the hero would want a perfect scalp that Sam knew he need not fear the tomahawk, for the hatchet, as old Gus Hinkle loved to tell the greenhorns, spiled the scalp. For about 5 minutes, the horse's eyes told him the Indian stood and looked and listened. Sam knew that the redskin was studying the prone body for the signs of breathing. He must have decided at last that his foe was not feigning, for the bay lifted his head suddenly a good 3 inches, flared his nostrils, and opened his eyes wider. These told Sam not only that the Indian was again advancing, but advancing more swiftly. That was good. Perhaps he was now coming at a fair walk, eager to lift the scalp and possess the horse. He knew that the Indian would stop again when only 25 or 30 feet away, and again study the body for the signs of breathing. If he saw none, he would again advance, hoping to seize the bridle reins. If the horse backed away, the Indian would pursue it if he had no doubt that Sam was dead. Sam had his hands in such a position that he could draw a small breath without movement. It was his abdomen and not his diaphragm that moved a little in and out. As he waited, he could recall no time in his life when he had been more tense and anxious. He tried to relax just a little, for when the moment came to move, he would have to move with what mountain men called greased lightning, which was almost as fast as the cougar's speed when it leapt from the ledge to the shoulders of moose or elk. What disturbed Sam most was the fact that his enemy was behind him. It gave him a touch of gooseflesh. His left eye, strained and smarting, and staring upward, and winking fast to keep the tears away, and its side clear, watched the bay's head. He figured that when the foe was 15 feet away, or surely no less than 10, the horse would bug his eyes and perhaps snort a little, and back off 2 or 3 steps. That was the moment when Sam would make his move, for in that instant the horse's movements and its compulsion to flight would rivet the Indian's attention. Staring up, Sam saw that the bay's eyes were growing a little wider all the time. They were an exact measure of the Indian's movements and of his distance from Sam. But there were other registers in the handsome, sensitive face of the bay, in the ears, the nostrils, in the nerves down the cheek and the neck. What a picture he made, standing guard over his prone master, and staring in fright and anger and astonishment at the noiseless, slinking creature in war paint and headdress coming forward. The sudden low snort came a little sooner than Sam had expected. The horse jerked his head up a good 6 inches, and his eyes bugged with a mixture of ferocity and terror. In the same instant he backed off 2 swift steps, and in that instant Sam moved. His whole body shot backwards about 3 feet, propelled by his hands and arms, and all his muscles turned hard and tense for the leap that followed. In the moment of moving backwards, he also came to his feet, his lungs filling with air, and he exploded a dreadful screaming cry that in the dry atmosphere could have been heard for 2 miles. It was such a fearful screech of rage that the Indian, only a few feet from the horse, his hands reaching out, was stricken, and before his nerveless right hand could raise his knife, Sam's powerful grasp was on his throat, and the bones in his neck went snapping. As the bones snapped, Sam's right foot came up, and with tremendous power struck the red man in his loins, sending him in a reeling spin. An instant later, Sam was on him to cut off the right ear and the scalp, and it was when drawing his knife that he learned that the little finger of his right hand had been shot away. After a second glance at his hand, Sam turned away without taking the scalp and went to his horse. The beast had backed off about 60 feet, and there he stood, nostrils twitching, his whole body trembling, his bulging eyes looking at his master. Sam went up to him slowly, gently saying, "It's all right, old feller, it's all right," and voice and hands tried to soothe him. Gentle palms caressed the head and neck, stroked down the flat hard cheeks, and down the forehead, a forefinger softly patting just above the upper lid of the eyes. Standing to the left of the head, Sam put his right hand under the chin to the right cheek, as Lotus had done with her pony that farewell morning. And while he stroked the cheek, he searched the horizon around him and talked all the while. "You saved my life, old feller. Do you know that? You're better'n the wren and the road runner and the magpie." Looking over the horse, Sam saw that he was covered with sweat, so he went on talking and patting until the bay no longer trembled and had a normal expression in his eyes. And not until then did Sam look at the stock of his rifle. A piece of it had been shot out along with his finger. The bullet had taken his finger, hit the stock, deflected, and plowed a furrow across Sam's stomach and up his ribs. 2 inches back of a rib, it had torn out a piece of skin and flesh as big as his thumb. Drawing his leather clothing up, he studied his wounds. They were nothing at all. He would have a long scar across his side, and he guessed he would call it his Lotus scar. He would fill the wounds with tobacco and with balsam sap when he came to spruce trees. For a few moments he looked at the bloody bone stub of his finger and wondered if he ought to try to draw the skin over it. He guessed not. Going over to the Indian, he tried to make out the features, but they were lost in hump fat and red ochre. The Indian braves, he was thinking, were only boys at heart. They simply must smear themselves with rancid grease and dance through a clutter of rituals and shriek like lunatics to get their blood up. Was this eagle beak? In any case, it was one of the 20. Sam looked into the medicine bag. Pieces of the totem should be in it, teeth, claws, tail, beak, or something. There was a beak. Sam studied it and thought it might be the beak of the golden eagle. Had he slain the most deadly one of all his enemies? He hoped he had. All the while, scanning the world around him, he took off the moccasins, thinking that Kate could use them, took the scalp and shook blood from it, and hung it on an ear from a saddle string, chewed tobacco and rubbed its juice into his wounds and over the bone stub, and then mounted the bay. Farther north, in Crow country, he would hang the medicine bag above a well-traveled trail for all the passing braves to see. Glancing over at the dead warrior, he thought it a pity to leave such a brave man to the vultures and ravens. He sat, the rifle across his left arm, and looked round him. It was God-forsaken country all right. If it could be said that the Almighty had disowned any of his handiwork, as far as a man could see, in all directions it was ravines, gullies, washes, eroded bluffs, alkali lime wastes, with only stunted plants. He didn't suppose that the bones of Eagle Beak would ever be found away out here. Curious to learn how he had been so neatly ambushed, Sam rode in the direction from which the bullet had come. He found the exact spot where his foe had knelt and fired, and guessed the distance at 200 yards. It was a fair shot at that distance. He remembered that most Indians preferred gut shots. A good gut shot might take time, but it always killed, whereas a shot in the rib cage might not be mortal unless it struck the heart or exploded the liver. Sam now perceived how the enemy had got close to him. Below was a deep ravine that ran 40 yards east, swung sharply to the south for about a mile, and then to the southwest. 2 miles back, Sam had crossed the head of this ravine. Eagle Beak, on his trail, had ridden swiftly up the ravine to wait for him. Sam felt hopelessly stupid. Only a fool would ride up a long ridge with a deep ravine parallel to his line of travel. He might as well walk naked into a Crow village and climb into the pot and tell the squaws to pour boiling water over him. Descending into the ravine, Sam found the Indian's pony in a thicket of scrub juniper. It was a fine horse. The 20 picked warriors had had their choice from large herds. Near the horse was a bedroll. Feeling over it, Sam could tell that inside were ammunition and a skin of pemmican. There was no saddle. After tying the roll across the pony, Sam mounted the bay and, leading the pony, climbed out of the ravine. The red man's rifle he left by the stone where it had been fired. He was hungry, but his thoughts were on the mussel shell and back with the dead warrior. On his way to the Yellowstone, he killed 5 more warriors, 3 of whom, their horses and the equipment said, belonged to the 20. He was a little tired of killing these people. It was too much like knocking over full hens. 2 of those he killed were mere boys, with poor weapons, shaky trigger fingers, and a childlike belief in magic. Perhaps he ought to go visit his father-in-law. He might find another lotus there. Chapter 21. He was thinking of all this while riding across wolf country. During the deep winters in northern latitudes, wolves roamed over the frozen world, looking for deer, elk, moose, even for mountain sheep and goat that had become feeble from hunger and got stuck in the snow. When spring came, wolves looked for dead animals that had been buried by snowslides. The grizzly and other bears, ravenous with hunger after the long sleep, also surged along steep mountainsides where the avalanches of melting snow swept down, uncovering the tender shoots of early plants and animals that had died during the fall and winter. Sometimes wolf and bear met on these feeding grounds. In the southern foothills of the Big Horns, 4 big gray prairie wolves, the mother and father and 2 children, had found several deer that had been smothered by a snowslide. They had eaten and were making a cache of the remainder at the base of a sheer ledge that rose above them, when with a movement as swift as any in the animal world, the bitch turned, at the same time lifting her head and pulling her lips back to show her fangs. A deep warning growl came up her throat. The father wolf, alerted, looked over at his mate. The two youngsters also sounded a warning. Then all four, backs arched, ears forward, fangs clicking, looked off to the left, where an enormous male grizzly had risen to his hind feet to have a better look around him. He had smelled the dead flesh. There he stood, a monster, his small eyes peering, his front furry paws hanging loosely. But for his sensitive sniffing nose, he seemed to be in an attitude of prayer. Because the wolves were 100 yards away, it is possible that the bear didn't see them, for like the buffaloes, his eyesight was poor, but he smelled the meat, and he thought he knew where it was. Sinking soundlessly to all 4 feet, he moved forward in an easy rolling gait of fat and fur. The wolves watched him come on, and warned him with growls and snappings, and back steadily arching higher. Even if the grizzly had seen the 4 of them, he wouldn't have paused. This male weighed 1,100 pounds, and was afraid of nothing on earth that he had ever seen. Though he did try to keep sensibly out of sight when he smelled men and gunpowder. His only plan was to find the flesh and eat, and then stretch out for a siesta in the warm sun. When 60 feet from the wolves, he heard them, and his dim eyes saw them. He then did what a grizzly bear usually did when faced by something whose nature and purpose he was not sure of. He rose to his hind legs, his front paws again in that curious attitude of prayer. He saw the 4 wolves. They now stood abreast, facing him, backs arched, mouths open, teeth snapping. He smelled the animal anger in them, but he also smelled the flesh, and he was too hungry to be prudent. When the bear sank again and stood on his 4 enormous paws, he seemed to consider his position for a few moments, and then moved forward. And 4 wolves shot toward him like 4 grey lightning flashes. If a man's eyes had been watching, and from the ledge above a man's eyes were watching, they couldn't have followed the incredible speed and agility and grace of these 4 wild dogs. As the father wolf shot past on the bear's right, he snapped savagely at the sensitive nose, and on the other side the mother wolf snapped at it. And though the grizzly in a flash raised a paw and swept an area, long curved talons extended, the wolves not only were gone from his reach, but had rushed past his flanks and turned and leapt to his back. Both mother and father had fangs over 2 inches long, and jaws so powerful they could crack the leg bones of an elk. Both nosed into the deep fur and sank their teeth in the upper flanks, and when the bear, astonished and burning with anger, made woofing sounds and awkwardly rose to his hind legs, the 2 wolves clung to him, fangs buried. The youngsters, obeying the knowledge that lay deep in their instincts, flashed forward the moment the bear reared, and tried to bite and tear through fur and hide to his ham tendons. The grizzly was covered over with tawny gray furies, determined to kill him. Most bears are by nature placid, good-natured, and friendly. If this grizzly had any power of thought in his small dark skull, he must have wondered why he should be attacked merely because he wanted food. All the first sounds he made were of astonishment and wonder. Then came exclamations of pain and anger. And when the parent wolves dropped from the back and gouged at the hams, eager to chew the tendons in two, the grizzly exploded with a roar of rage that shook the mountain, and sinking again to 4 feet, turned swiftly round and round, his front paws sweeping across great arcs, but never touching his foes. It was now that the wolves showed their amazing agility and daring. not a dog among them, not even the young ones, but knew that if the bear's powerful paw struck them, they would be ripped open from shoulder to ham. Yet with superlative courage they took their chances. The four of them were marvels of speed and light, as they flashed in and struck, flashed out, burned in a lightning instant, and struck again. Never once was one found in the way of another. Time after time the bear's long deadly claws came within an inch or less of striking dog flesh, but not once during the fight was wolf touched by fang or talon. The bear was so goaded, so out of his mind with fury and frustration, that he set up a bawling roar that became louder and louder, until the hills round about echoed it. For 20 minutes the savage fight continued, and not for a moment did any of the wolves pause in their lightning attack. The grizzly's fare was too deep, his hide too thick and tough, for the dogs to be able to hamstring him. Besides, he kept turning or standing up and coming down, or shaking himself like a monster in a great fur coat, or striking out with both front paws. Now and then the parents shifted their attack to his flanks or underbelly, and the father, in an act of superb courage, faced the monster and struck and furrowed the sensitive nose. This brought from the bear a cry that must have been heard for miles. The man on the ledge was wishing that a piece of great music could be played above the struggle, the tempest in the sonata in F minor, or, yes, indeed, the choral in the ninth. As suddenly as it began, it was all over. The bear had had enough. He turned back the way he had come and moved off in a rolling gait lope, whimpering like a spanked child. After 50 yards he looked back across a shoulder. Then he did something that would have moved any heart but a wolf heart. He stopped and rose to his full height and looked back at his exhausted and snarling enemies, his small black eyes bright with wonder, red drops falling from his nose. After a few moments, in which he saw little and learned nothing, he came down soundlessly, and in his rolling gait went over the hills and out of sight. On the ledge above the four wolves, a tall man shook a clenched fist at the sky. Almighty God, what a fight it had been! He sang a few triumphant bars in his loudest baritone, and then addressed himself to the four dogs, who, mouths open and sides heaving, looked up at him. "Higher, fellers! Sure as shooting that was no fight for greenhorns. I salute you, wild wolves of the mountains. This here critter knows a good hugging match when he sees one, and that was just about the best he has ever seen." To the panting wolves, still staring up, he said, "Higher!" and waved a hand at them. "Goodbye, brave warriors! Keep your teeth sharp, and good luck!" Sam had a lively admiration for the big gray wolf. He thought it the most intelligent of all the wild beasts, in tracking, in dodging enemies, including traps, and in loyalty to his own kind. He knew there were stories of wolves that devoured one another when half dead with hunger, but no mountain man had any proof of it. The human animal would eat his own kind, but not the wolf. On the contrary, a wolf family would fight to the death to protect one another, and that was more than most human families would do. No other beast, and only a few of the birds, would do that. He liked the clean, deadly way in which they fought. Around campfires, mountain men raised the question, which of the beasts in the Rocky Mountains was king? Now and then one argued that the grizzly was, and he was, beast for beast. But twice now Sam had seen wolves put a grizzly on the run. He knew all the wolf calls. Some men said there were 5, some 6. Sam could identify only 5. There was the high-keyed, rasping whine the parents made when warning or commanding their pups. The hunting call, a loud, deep-throated howl in 2 or more keys, followed by sharp barking. The shrill, eager yelping when in pursuit of prey. The announcement that the prey had been brought down, a deep growl exploding up the victorious throat. And the mating cry in midwinter, which was the chilling howl in the frozen white nights. As far as Sam could figure it out, the Almighty had made the world only for the brave and the strong, both male and female. And though Bill Williams said a woman's breast was a hard rock on which he could find no trail, and though some of the mountain men agreed with him, Sam thought the female of both man and beast had her special virtues. He liked best of all the way some of them would fight to the death for their children. And what female, he wondered, had ever fought more magnificently than the mother on the Muscle Shell? Not all mothers would fight, or even most of them. The buffalo cow, the big strong lubber, would bellow her head off and buck her eyes out, or make short charges at the wolves determined to bring her baby down. She would fall behind with her calf and then have to make the choice of leaving it or going with the herd. She always went with the herd. So did the elk mother, and so, Sam had heard, did the caribou mother. It was only a few of the flesh-eating mothers that really fought for their young. The bitch wolf would fight till she died, or the wolverine, the bobcat, the badger, the weasel, the bear, the cougar, and many more. These were all natural fighters. But the most remarkable courage for Sam was shown by some of the feathered mothers, who actually had nothing to fight with. He had seen a grouse mother fly into the face of a wolf and try to strike it down with her wings, and in the next moment he had seen that mother torn into pieces, while her downy little ones scattered to the undergrowth. He had seen the avocet spread her wings, open her absurdly long bill, and rush on her long spindly legs at the enemy, only to die as suddenly as the grouse mother. He had seen a horned lark with a leg and a wing broken rush from her nest at an enemy, half walking, rolling and fluttering on the good leg and the good wing. What the poor crippled creature, little more than a handful of feathers and song, had thought she could do against a coyote, Sam couldn't imagine. Or why the Creator had put such courage in creatures that had nothing to fight with. God had built into the osprey hawk knowledge of how to carry a fish in flight, so there would be the least possible wind resistance. Into the shrike mother the knowledge of how to spread her wings in hot weather to protect the babies in her nest. And into the red-tailed hawk the sense of how to execute in mid-air a deft maneuver when the falcon came down to strike. The red tail suddenly turned over on its back and presented its talons. But he had not built into the meadowlark, one of the superlative musicians, the sense not to build its nest on the ground, where every coyote, bobcat, weasel, and wolverine could easily find it. Reading nature for Sam was like reading the Bible. In both, the will of the Creator was plain, or so anyway it had seemed to him since coming west. His experiences had run the gamut from the tenderest to the most savage emotions. One day he had looked down from a ledge on 3 baby red-tails in a nest with a dead squirrel. One baby hawk, no larger than his brothers, but more aggressive, was so determined to have all the squirrel that when the other two strove for a part of it, he struck them fiercely with talons and beak, and then, seizing one by the tail, appended him and pushed him over the rim of the nest and down. One morning he had lain in daylight dusk in a kind of tent he had made, and watched the marvelous flight of two swallows flashing back and forth just above him, as they looked over his interior to see if it was suitable for a nest. And another time he had observed the amazing mating dance of the sage-cock. The birds had returned to their strutting grounds, to which they came year after year, and while the plainly dressed hens looked for insects and seemed not to care at all for wooing, the handsome males showed themselves off in dance steps. A cock would take 6 or 8 quick steps and half turn, his wings drooping, his spiked tail spread to its fullest width, his proud head high and back, his chest puffed full of arrogance. He looked as if he were showing off the pure snowy whiteness of the feathers around his neck. As he danced, repeating his steps and half-turn, feathers parted and small bare areas of the body became visible, looking like grey leather, and his air sacs, for all the world like 2 eggs nesting in white down, alternately filled and collapsed. As the air sacs collapsed, he uttered a kind of gobbling or plopping sound, and raised his wings, holding them high an instant, and letting them fall. This part of his act he usually repeated 3 times, and then danced again. His gutturals were in a series of 3, and at the end of the 3rd, the cock voiced a high flute-like sound that carried to the farthest hen in the area. When 30 or 40 cocks were dancing and strutting, the mountain men thought it one of the doggondest spectacles they had ever seen. But whether it was the loon, treading with both feet and wing-tips at high speed across the waters and uttering his insane yell, or the hummingbird poised on wings that moved too fast for the human eye, while with her long bill she thrust deep into the throat of her baby and pumped food into its stomach, or meadowlark, or purple-finch, or bluebird, or wood thrush, pouring upon the golden air their liquid notes, or the water ouzel diving 20 feet to stroll along the bottom of a pool, or the snipe's tail feathers making fantastic music at dusk, or the harsh symphony from the music boxes of 100 frogs and toads. It was all for Sam a part of a divine plan, and he loved it all. What made him most unhappy were the hours he had to give to sleep, in a life that was short at best. He thought that possibly the Creator had given sleep to his creatures so that they would awaken with the eyes of morning and a fresh discovery of the world. Sam was thinking these thoughts as he rode down the Musselshell and came close to Kate's shack. He was in a more sentimental mood than was usual for him, deep gone in mush and molasses. Bill might have said, if he could have looked into Sam's soul. For Sam was thinking of the bones in the cairn, and his arms were filled with flowers. His first sight of the woman was halfway up the hill with a pail of water. He sat and watched her around her plants and flowers, and his thoughts went out to all the wild mothers he knew. "Hello, Kate," he said after riding up to her yard. He had hoped that her name would make her look at him, but she gave no heed at all. She looked thinner, she looked older. There was a lot of white in her hair now, and deep seams all over her face. He thought she was not yet 40, but she looked 80. Instead of moccasins, he and other men had brought her a dozen pairs. She still wore her tattered old shoes, bound to her feet with leather strings. Her garments were cotton rags, covered with patches. But her sage looked nice, and her flowers looked eager and strong. He wondered if she would ride his pack horse and go with him down the river to meet a steamboat, but he knew she would not. When her pail was empty, she went back down the hill, and the moment she was out of sight, Sam looked into the cabin. Nothing had changed. The bed was still just inside the door, and over by the north wall were a few things, including a pile of skins. He saw no rifle or axe or knife. She seemed not to know that there were enemies in the world, perhaps because she had sunk so deep into loneliness and sorrow, or had entered so fully into heaven. The time would come, he supposed, when she would forget to eat or to wrap herself against the cold. By the river he ate a dry lunch and washed it down with river water. On his way in he had seen a few buffalo, and now collated that he ought to get one and jerk a pile of beef. He guessed he ought to gather a bushel of berries and dry them for her, for the time was again late August, and the service berries were ripe. Before coming here he had picked up his pelts at Bill's spot and had gone to Bridger's to buy some things, chiefly on credit. It took a lot of pelts, with sugar $1 a pound, coffee $1.25, blue cloth $4 a yard, and rum $12 a gallon. He had found a 5-gallon keg of rum by the trail, cached by Mormons or other immigrants. He hoped that Mormons had left it, for they were not supposed to drink rum or coffee or tea, though washing soap was $1.50 a pound, and he brought a pound to Kate. For his father-in-law he had a copper kettle, and for his sister-in-law he had blue cloth and vermilion and assorted beads. The next day he gathered berries and spread them on a robe in the sun to dry. He shot a young buffalo and brought it to the river bottom. He then went up the hill and over to the cairn. He had removed a stone and thrust his armful of flowers back over the bones, and now, reaching in, he clasped the skull of his wife and looked at Kate. She was watering her flowers. "My mother raises flowers," he said, wishing he could make her talk. "Yours are just as nice." He meant the Indian paintbrush, paint Steeman and Aster. Patting the skull and pushing flowers down on it, he drew his arm out and walked over to Kate. Would she come down to the river and have supper with him? Did she want to learn how to jerk flesh? Had she written a letter to her people that he could send out for her? She took her pail and turned down the path, and Sam followed her. He watched her at the river dip the pail full and turn back, and he followed her halfway up the hill. Then he turned to the task of drying the meat. From the loin he put aside steaks for his supper and breakfast, and sliced the flesh of hams and shoulders. The slices he laid in piles and cut down through the piles. Jerky should be not more than 2 or 3 inches wide, and from 4 to 6 inches long. Green saplings above a fire he covered with slices of flesh, and set up a second rack, and a third. In a smaller fire he laid a part of his steaks, and basted them with hot fat. Poor old critter! She was nothing much but hide and bones. Could he get her to eat a steak and a hot biscuit? He would have given a year of his life to bring a smile to her face. He would have trembled with joy if he could have made her talk. His mouth watered, his eyes smarted in the smoke of 4 fires. His body, clothed in leather, itched in the heat, but there was a feast to look forward to. And lo, what heaven it would be if Lotus were here. The afternoon waned, the sun sank, and it was dusk, and down the hill came a dreadful sound. Sam thought at first that he heard a wolf scream, then that it was the cry of a buffalo or elk calf under wolf teeth. But no, God, no, it was the woman. He couldn't see her, but he could hear her unearthly, blood-chilling lament, and he had a picture of her, there by the graves, bowed, snarls of grey hair falling over her face. Knocking the fires down so that the meat would not burn, Sam took his rifle and ran up the hill. Yes, there she was, as he had imagined her, bowing low and rising, sinking in what seemed to be a long shudder, and rising with gasping sobs. In all his life he had never heard sounds of such utter sadness and loss. They made him feel weak and furious and helpless. After running back down the hill to take care of the meat, he stood among the fires and looked back and forth at drying rags and listened. He couldn't put away the thought that it was his presence that had touched her off to this bitter lament out of grief and fear. My God, did she think he was an Indian? He thought of that quiet and delightful evening when he had played for her and they had sung together. But now her voice was wild and piercing and full of such horrors as only a heart-stricken mother could feel. He looked west, where the Blackfeet lurked, and south, where the crows waited for him. Removing the layers of meat and covering the racks with raw flesh, he laid a choice steak on a large cottonwood chip and went up the hill. The woman was still bowing and rising. Kneeling before her, Sam said he had brought her a fine hot steak, knowing that it would do no good to say anything. He held the hot meat so that its aroma would rise to her nostrils. Would she look at it, please? Would she take at least one bite? He felt an impulse to shake the hell out of her, but it passed in an instant. He stood up, looking round him and trying to think of something to do. There seemed to be only the presence of death here. The silent cairn was full of it, the shack and this woman. He bent over and said in her ear, quietly, "I also have sorrow, Mrs. Bowden. My wife and child, the Indians killed them too, and they are there, their bones, in that pile of rocks. But no matter what our grief, we have to go on living." He straightened and looked at the sky, wondering what the father thought of a woman like Kate. Sam then faced her, laid the chip and steak down, took her arms away from her face, set the steak on her lap, and returned her arms. It was like moving the arms of a dead person who hadn't yet turned rigid. He went back to the fires and tried to eat, but his appetite was no good. Up the hill he could hear the woman crying. The odor of hot steak was rising to her nostrils, and she was crying, for she didn't know what hot steak was, and she was afraid of what she didn't know. A man had to listen to a lament like that, as he had to listen if his mother spoke, or the Almighty. It was one of the deep and eternal things. Sam filled his pipe and sat, rifle across his lap, listening and thinking. He had aroused some terrible fear in her. She knew he was with her, yet didn't know, and her lament was a prayer to God to send him away. The poor lonely thing, he thought, puffing and thinking. After he had jerked all the beef and put the meat in buckskin bags and put out the fires and looked after his horses, he sat again and smoked. Then he took his rifle and harp and went up the hill, and came in behind the hummock where he had lain and played. He began softly with the Ave Maria, and then played back and forth from one tender thing to another, trying to make the music sound as if it were in heaven or came from there. And he was overjoyed when suddenly he heard her singing. How beautiful it was! For his own sake and for the bones in the cairn, he played a few things that he had played for Lotus and sung for her. and he played old hymns and Corelli and Schubert softly, so that the music reached her and faded, and reached her again, as though the Creator were closing windows and putting some of the musicians to bed. After 2 hours he figured that if the music faded away gradually, she would feel all right about it. At midnight she fell silent. At daylight Sam was awake, and the first sound he heard was her footfalls on the path. He watched her go to the river and return. The heavy pail bent her over, and she looked very frail and thin and old. Carrying water to flowers that bloomed above graves was, he supposed, what people called ritual. It seemed to be symbolic. It seemed to be deeper than the conscious mind. When she came again, Sam rolled out, and with his rifle and 100 pounds of jerked flesh over his shoulder, he went up the hill while she was at the river. And the first thing he looked for was the stake. It was there, with the appearance of something that had spilled from her lap when she stood up. He turned and watched her come up the hill, bent forward, her shoulders looking pulled out of joint. Her face seemed bloodless and drawn, as from famine, fatigue, and want to sleep. He had set the meat inside her cabin by the bed, where she couldn't fail to find it. He remained in this area until October, when the first snow fell. He put fresh stakes under the white skulls with their fringe of hair, gathered more wild fruit, and brought deer from the hills. With deer flesh and berries he made pemmican for her. With her old shovel he put 3 inches of earth on the cabin's roof, and banked earth all the way around it to the top of the first log. He brought river mud and used it for mortar to fill the cracks. When he could think of nothing more to do, he packed his horse and saddled the bay, but even then stood, undecided, looking up the hill. There she was, a bent old mother, in ragged shoes and tatters, carrying water to flowers, withered by frosts, and needing no water now. Not sure that he would ever see her again, who had become a precious part of his life, he went up the hill, leading his beasts, for a goodbye look at these familiar things. Framing her sad face with his 2 big hands, he kissed her forehead and her grey hair. "Goodbye," he said. "I'll see you before long." He was to see her again a lot sooner than he expected to.